The G20 was set up as a multilateral forum to discuss global economic affairs, but geopolitical tensions are threatening to derail the G20 economic agenda. To talk about the prevailing economic and geopolitical winds blowing right ahead of the big G20 summit in India, I'm joined on the news track by two renowned commentators who ply their craft at the intersection of geopolitics and geoeconomics. I have with me on the news track Martin Wolf, the chief economics commentator at the Financial Times, joining us from London, and Gideon Rachman, the chief foreign affairs commentator of the Financial Times, joining us from Hong Kong. We could just as well do a short news meeting here as well. Thank you very much, Martin and Gideon, for joining us. I want to start by asking you, Gideon Rachman, sitting where you are in Hong Kong at this moment, about your broad sense of the G20 summit in India in the way that is shaping up from your perspective. Prime Minister Modi and his government have invested a lot of energy, effort in trying to make this a grand success. Some big leaders have decided that they're not coming. What's your sense of how we're shaping up and building into this big G20 summit?
Well, clearly it's a big moment for India and for Modi, but I think there's been no doubt for some time that the G20 as an organization is in trouble. The Russia war on Ukraine has opened up a huge split inside it. You know, following the Indonesians who had this particular hot potato handed to them last year, they were wondering right up to the last moment what they would do about Putin, whether he would come, what kind of statement that could be made, and they just about got through it. And so, although I think it's both an opportunity but also an enormous challenge for India, because these divisions are opening up between the G20 nations. We're going back to something that looks more like a Cold War, not just the adversarial relationship between the West and Russia, but also an increasingly adversarial relationship between the US and China. And now this decision by Xi Jinping not to come to Delhi. And obviously he's a big miss. They're one of the two, if you like, superpowers of the current system. So the chances of getting a kind of global consensus on the kinds of issues that the G20 is meant to deal with, the economic issues, climate, debt restructuring, all that kind of thing, I think do recede a little bit. Although, of course, Xi is sending his prime minister, so it may be that China will still play ball to some extent.
Martin Wolf, in the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2008, the G20 emerged as the premier global platform for decision making, as it included not just the G7 countries but also the voice of the global south. In the tensions that are emerging now, do you think the G20 is becoming less relevant in the future, or do you think this is just a temporary blip from which the G20 might recover?
Well, first of all, I agree with everything Gideon said, so I won't go over that about where we are now. I think the contrast you point to between where we were in late 2008 and early 2009, when there were two summits in short order, and which really shaped the global response to the financial crisis and put the G20 at the head of government level on the map. This was a sort of transformative, positive moment for those of us who hoped for a move to greater global governance. And the G20 was remarkably successful, notably with the London meeting in early 2009, April, if I remember correctly. And what we've seen since then is the G20's development reflects the development in geopolitics and geoeconomics. And most notably so, I would say, since the election of Donald Trump, the decisive shift to the United States, the clear move of Xi Jinping's China in a more inward-looking and even more authoritarian direction, the Ukraine, the impact of COVID, which was dramatic, of course, on the world economy and world politics, and finally the war. And the result is now that the G20, in the context of its history, is obviously sort of a shell. This is in no way the fault of the Indian government, the Indian Prime Minister, who's clearly doing his best. But the reality is, G20, the G20 now looks like, cats in a bag. They just don't agree on anything, and the differences among them are very wide-ranging. They cover economics and politics over and above the traditional north-south differences and differences of opinion over how to handle key issues like climate. So making the G20 work is almost impossible, but that's a reflection of where the world is.
Gideon, Rahman, everyone has his own take on why Xi Jinping decided to skip the Delhi summit. He went to Johannesburg for BRICS. He is going to the US possibly, and Putin will be coming to China. Despite all of this, he's announced he's not coming to Delhi. Why do you think Xi, at this point, took this decision?
Well, I mean, the simplest explanation might simply be that it's a tit for tat, because Modi did not go to the Belt and Road Summit that Xi held, so maybe he's angry about that.
But India's never been part of the BRI. India's always opposed the BRI, and China has been a very active participant in the G20 before this.
Yeah, no, so clearly it's a deliberate snub. The question is whether the snub is just a tit for tat and that he wants to make a limited point about the BRI, or whether there's a bigger sense that he wants to snub India, or that he's uncomfortable with the G20. I suspect that it's a bit of both of the latter, that clearly Indian-Chinese tensions have been high ever since the incidents on the Himalayas, the killing on both sides. They are still capable of meeting in contexts such as the BRICS, but it's not an easy relationship. Maybe Xi doesn't feel comfortable being, India's guest in Delhi, or maybe he doesn't want to engage with the Americans at this particular point, because the last time that Biden spoke to Xi one-on-one was in the Bali G20 meeting. The Americans have been saying for a while that they want to get back to Bali. There's been a lot of troubles in the US-Chinese relationship, the balloon incident, cancelled meetings, etc., etc. So the Chinese may feel that this is a big prize, or a big moment anyway, when Xi and Biden re-engage, and they're not ready for it yet. So, but for whatever reason, it's very, very pointed that he's not coming. And I think it does make a point about, I was looking at the interview that you did with the Prime Minister Modi, where he talked about, the hope that the G20 could become the voice of the global South. But it does raise the question of, is there a coherent global South? If China and India are really loggerheads or not able to coordinate a position, then is there a global South ready to represent in this context?
Martin Wolf, so much is being said about the state of the Chinese economy. Now you've got two dynamics playing out. You've got companies like Country Garden, going bust, and you've also got, at the same time, Huawei coming up with a 5G phone, which when broken down seems to have highly sophisticated semiconductor chips inside it. What's your reading as a whole of the Chinese economy, given that a lot of the economic data now seems to have gone dark?
I think this is, to me, the most interesting economic question in the world right now. And I noticed that there's lots of Western commentary that is very gleeful and confident that this is now the end of the Chinese growth story. My honest view is, at the moment, I haven't made up my mind. And I think that is the right position to take. Let me just set out the arguments. There's a perfectly straightforward short-term argument, which is that which has two elements to it: that the COVID policy and what went with the COVID policy had much bigger effects on Chinese confidence, both consumers and of business, and has affected, therefore, demand and supply very significantly, and is leading to much greater short-term weakness than expected. And the second is that we've got to the end of what was an extraordinary, and it was widely accepted, unsustainable property bubble. I've written lots and lots about this. And while it's not going to lead to the sort of financial crisis, or it's unlikely to lead to the sort of financial crisis that we saw in the West in 2008-9, it's going to lead to a slowdown in demand. And the result of this is they've got a real, as it were, recession. But that doesn't mean necessarily that the long-term structural growth of China has unambiguously decelerated across the board. It means that they have a structural problem, which is to deal with the overhang of bad debt and the decline in the boom in the property sector. And they have the problem of what the COVID policy has done to confidence. That seems to me reasonably reasonably clear. What is open to question, and this would involve a lot of discussion, is whether the entire long run underlying growth dynamic of China is over. And I believe that provided they take the right decisions, it's probably premature to think that China's growth at a faster rate than the West, let's say 4 or 5 against 2 or so, that is over. I'm not yet confident that we can state that Chinese rapid growth and catch-up is now over.
Part of the reason China grew the way that it did over the past few decades is because it emerged as a manufacturing hub for the rest of the world. We're already seeing the US Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, when she was in Beijing, say China is becoming increasingly uninvestable for international firms, and because of ad hoc economic decision making, companies are finding it very unpredictable to work in China. Could that then suggest, possibly, Martin Wolf, that the best days for the Chinese economy in terms of growth are now behind it?
Well, in some sense, that the answer to that has to be yes. China grew at about 10% a year. For an economy of that size, that's simply unbelievable. There was never the slightest chance it could sustain that growth for the next 20 or 30 years. The question is it over the next 20 years going to be 5%, 4 or 5%, or is it going to be 1 or 2, or is it going to actually shrink? And that was what I was talking about. But there's no doubt there are massive headwinds to China. First of all, it's already relatively much richer than it was. The world economy is much less accommodating than it was. It's not going to get the inflow of technology that it was going to have. Its demography is deteriorating, investment opportunities are clearly diminishing. All that's obvious. Nonetheless, its productivity overall is about a third of US levels. It has huge technological strength of its own, not across the board, but there's no doubt its relative technological position is completely different from it was 30 or 40 years ago. And it seems to me impossible to state that they can't manage 4 or 5% growth in a country where the savings rate is 40% plus, where they have a vast number of very talented and high qualified people, unbelievable quantities of engineers and so forth, and lots of advanced technology. So I think it's going to fall somewhere between the 2-3% the West, I think, hopes for, and the 5%, which seems to me perfectly feasible. But the old days of Chinese growth are, of course, completely irrecoverable. That could never have been sustained on that scale for very much longer.
Gideon, Rachman, in the interview that we did with Prime Minister Modi, he speaks of how he hopes the G20 in India will emerge as the catalyst of a new world order. We saw Borge Brande, who you know well, the president of the World Economic Forum at the India at 100 summit, tell us in an interaction that he sees in the next 10 years India becoming a $10 trillion economy and the global order being shaped by what he termed the G3, the United States, China and India. Is that an optimism you share, or do you think it will be too premature to talk about the emergence of a G3?
To me, I think that is premature. I mean, it depends what you mean by the world order being shaped. I mean, there's one thing which is economic weight, but there's also strategic weight, military power, and then there's having the structures with which to express power. And certainly India's, developing, it's the economy everybody's excited about. It's a huge country. One can see the potential there. But in terms of military power, the US is unrivaled, both in terms of its global reach and its alliance system, which really China has nothing comparable to it. But China has poured money into its military. By some measures, it has the largest navy in the world, and it's going through a very rapid nuclear arms build-up and so on. So I think that it's a military player or a potential military player in a way that India isn't and perhaps doesn't want to be. In a way, hats off to the India if they don't have massive military ambitions. But I do think that hard power aspect is significant to being a shaper of the global order. You need both. I mean, Russia its economy was never large enough to support its superpower ambitions, and we discover actually its military wasn't as good as they claimed. But China and the US are the two countries I think that have both the military wherewithal and the economic size. And also, I'm interested that Borger Brenda should say that because he does rather forget Europe, which is growing slowly, but by some measures, the EU single market, certainly the EU single market plus the UK, is a larger market than any other in the world, and remains has plenty of technologically advanced companies, etc. Plus, if you agglomerate European military power, it's also not insignificant. So I think that the Europeans, who incidentally also have 2 of the 5 seats, or 3 of the 5 seats, if you count the Russians as Europeans, on the UN Security Council for historic reasons, also shouldn't be counted out of the picture.
Yeah, and that's also where the WEF is based. So yes, it is interesting that sitting in Switzerland, he's saying this, but he also said this at the India at 100 summit. Martin, well, so much is being spoken of in India about India potentially becoming the 3rd largest economy in the world by 2027. Now, whether it's 2027 or 28 or maybe 2030, that is still contested. But the idea that India will be the 3rd largest economy in the world seems in some senses inevitable. Now, the question is, and I'm interested in your perspective on this, is it a matter of just arithmetic inevitability as the Indian opposition claims, or do you think it also has to do at this moment from a global outlook to do with the kind of political stability that exists in India, current policies which the government claims is what has propelled India from number 10 years ago to being the 3rd largest economy in a few years from now?
So fascinating. First of all, I would just repeat what Gideon said. I consider Europe to be an integrated economy, and it is and will remain bigger than India. But if we consider countries formally defined, that is a perfectly plausible ambition. My expectation is that India's economy should be able to grow in real terms at about 6% a year or so over the next several years. And that ought to be the fastest growth of any really large economy. And it will therefore continue a relative rise. If you're asking, is this due to the present government or further back, I consider the turning point for the Indian economy to be the early 90s, and the trend has continued since then, and the growth has been slower since the financial crisis than before it, and that's been true over both administrations. So I think it's a quality of India itself. And finally, of course, I would stress that in achieving economically, of course, India has a very large number of challenges. Its industrial sector remains relatively weak. Its export sector has never rivaled what the Chinese have achieved. Unemployment is a very, very big problem in India. But yes, I think it's perfectly plausible that India will continue to rise and become, if we ignore Europe, the 3rd most important economy in the world. But it will, and Gideon is clearly right, under almost any assumptions, remain far, far behind China and the US for at least the next 20 years and probably beyond that.
Gideon, Rachman, one of the things that's been stressed during India's G20 presidency is the Prime Minister's attempt to make India the voice of the global South. Now, China has, over the past few decades, tried to build inroads with countries in Africa, South America and elsewhere to make itself the natural leader of the global South. India is trying to give the African Union a permanent position in the G20, and that's pitched as one of the big ideas of the Indian presidency. Do you see this idea of India trying to be the voice of the global South, leading to a contestation with China, which sees itself as the natural leader of the global South?
Yeah, I think there is an implicit contest going on there. I mean, I think the way that India's played it is very interesting because it's trying to have a foot both in the Western world camp and in the sort of global South camp, including organizations that are arguably increasingly dominated by China. So that, the BRICS summit, you would know better than me what India's attitude to the expansion of it was, but I think that it was certainly something pushed very, very hard by China, which I think now sees the BRICS as a potential alternative to the G7. And I think, incidentally, since we're talking about the G20, one thing to note is that after the big first leader summit of the G20, a lot of people said the G7 would disappear, that it was no longer relevant. And I think even in the West, people felt that. But now I would say the US is putting considerable more energy into the G7 than to the G20 because it's strategically and politically a more coherent group. It's basically the Western world, and they are more likely to come up with real policies than the G20 is. I think for India, this idea of, for the moment, trying to keep a foot in both camps makes sense. Go to the BRICS, go to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but also accept the invitations to the G7 summits, be a member of the Quad, because we don't know how these strategic rivalries are going to play out. And indeed, although what India's continuing relationship with Russia has clearly antagonized the West, the oil sales and so on, I think to some extent people in the West accept parts of the Indian argument that it's to everybody's benefit if there is a large country like India that kind of has relations with everybody. But I do wonder, in this period of rising tensions between the US and China, the Ukraine war, and now this kind of big question mark we've been asking about, well, what is Xi Jinping up to, both in his attitude to India as expressed through the G20, how long this straddle by India is going to be sustainable. At a certain point, is it going to be a situation where they are going to have to make some choices that so far they've really avoided?
Martin Wolf, even America is trying to ensure that the economic relationship with China doesn't degenerate to a point of no return. They're trying to keep the economic conversation going while accepting the element of competition and even a certain amount of adversity. Do you see India being able to continue to be a part of the Quad, be an invitee to the G7, and yet be a part of the SCO and BRICS? Or do you think at some point in time this trapeze will need to end and India would need to pick a side?
Well, I think I'd rather follow Gideon's view. India is, I think, quite cleverly trying to be a member of almost everything. And that is, I think, a position that it's probably it is more capable of being in that position than any other significant country. And good luck to it, as it were. The question, of course, is whether that's sustainable and whether it's effective. I'd like to stress the latter point. I'll come to both. On the sustainability, it's sustainable so long as the rivalries between dominant powers, which are shaping the transformation of current global politics and economics, remain manageable and containable. In other words, so long as you don't have to choose which side to belong to. And that's where we are now, and I very much hope we will remain there, that it doesn't get to that point. And in that situation, India can, of course, try to be part of everything. Then you get to the question of effectiveness. You talk particularly about the leadership of the Global South, which brings me back very much to my childhood days and youthful days when there was the Global Non-Aligned Movement and India was a leader of the Global Non-Aligned Movement. And the question really is there geopolitically such a thing as the Global South? I don't like the phrase anyway, but I leave that aside. I just don't think geopolitically there is. The Global South contains the vast majority of human beings, and they have vastly divergent interests, positions, economic, geopolitical. And the one thing they do share is they want more from the global north. And in that sense, India can try to lead that group to some extent. But basically, the global south is not, and Gideon suggested that, a coherent grouping. And the very fact that China and India are both vying to be leaders of it sort of suggests that fact. So I would say that India should do the best it can with this position, exploit every opportunity it can, but it's probably not going to be a completely effective geopolitical strategy. And I'm reasonably certain that the Modi government understands that.
Gideon, what's your sense of how the Russia-Ukraine war shapes up from here? In the past few days, Ukraine's been claiming some successes in its counter-offensive. We've seen some drone attacks in Russia as well. There's been a change in the defense ministry. From where things are, where do you see this war go?
Well, I think first thing to say is that, this war, like all wars, is very unpredictable, and there have been several things that weren't anticipated. The complete failure initially of Russia's assault on Kiev, then things like the fall of Kharkiv. And now I think that the Ukrainians, up until now, have certainly done slightly worse than the West had hoped in this counteroffensive. But, this was the most trailed counteroffensive that I can ever remember. It was for months that they were saying they were going to attack as they built up their forces. And that unfortunately gave the Russians the chance to build these formidable minefields, which are taking many lives as we speak. It does sound like the Ukrainians have made a small breakthrough, but the conventional wisdom, I think, is that unless there's another surprise, then that's not going to turn into a sort of sudden Russian collapse, which allows the Ukrainians to get to the Sea of Azov, which is their goal, very quickly. So I think people are now looking ahead to another year of fighting, and the question is, which side has the greater endurance? I mean, I think my concern is that Russians have greater resources in terms of manpower. The state of their economy, it's not great, but unlike the Ukrainians, they're not completely reliant on budgetary support from outside. And of course, the Ukrainians have this question mark over what happens in the American election. Is there this sort of sword of Damocles of the Donald Trump victory that might lead to a cutoff in Western aid? But it's not all negative. I mean, the West has been slow actually in making its mind up about giving Ukraine things. So they're still getting stuff that's been promised. The advanced fighter planes are not yet deployed, and they will be in the next fighting season, and that could make a real difference. I think that we'll probably get to a position where Ukraine will have more artillery shells and so on, and they are determined to keep fighting as far as one can tell. So I'm afraid it looks like another year of bloodshed ahead.
Martin, the Russian economy so far has held together better than most analysts expected when the sanctions were imposed. Is that the way you think it will stay, that they've been able to find ways around the sanctions and keep the economy going, even if it's not firing on all cylinders, but it's not coming apart in the way one may have imagined?
Well, actually, I'm not surprised by this. I wrote a column rather soon after the war fought, in which I discussed the history of sanctions. And I pointed out that, in general, the history of sanctions is a history of disappointment. It's very, very difficult to break an economy by sanctions, and that's true of much weaker ones. Iraq is, under Saddam, is one of many, many examples. Since Russia has huge natural resources, which it can continue to sell, it can earn money, either through bilateral payment systems or even in hard currency, and it can buy stuff. The people who believe the sanctions are working argue, and I can't comment on this, I just don't have the expertise, Gideon may, that they are preventing them from getting high quality materials needed for munitions. The sort of technology that they need to import in order to sustain high quality armed forces are very significantly constrained. But the fact that the Russian economy can continue to produce stuff, that it can continue to sell stuff abroad, for instance, to India, for example, and as a result can continue to import the stuff it needs to survive, uh, along with the fact that obviously it's a huge economy with huge resources, that therefore that it can survive sanctions seems to me completely unsurprising. It's one of the non-surprises, and this war will not be settled by the direct effect on the economy of the sanctions, though it might be affected by its impact on the quality of the Russian armed forces. My own worry throughout has been this would end as a very prolonged stalemate, and at the moment, at least to me, that looks like what's happening.
Last question, Gideon Rahman, about the US elections and what do you actually see happen? No one knows for sure, but given everything that you're seeing, reading, the dots that you're joining, where do you think we may end up?
Look, I mean, every American election seems extraordinary, but this one is more extraordinary than any I can remember. I mean, not least because of the strong possibility that Trump will be convicted of some of the charges facing him, particularly the federal charges relating to January the 6th, during the course of the campaign. So you have the possibility that one of the candidates will win the Republican nomination and then be sent to prison and be campaigning from prison. I mean, it sounds like a sort of a mini series that would be rejected for improbability, but that is actually possible. But I mean, I think that the thing that would concern, certainly me and the Biden White House is that despite all of this, not only has Trump got pretty much a lock on the Republican nomination, but he's neck and neck with Biden. And given the American Electoral College system and its inbuilt bias towards the Republicans, I think it's entirely conceivable that Donald Trump will win the presidency, this time next year.
And Martin Wolf, if that were to happen, if you were looking into your economic crystal ball, what do you think that means for the global economy? Trump as president again.
Well, I'll just make two comments. First, I agree with Gideon. I think this reflects, in my view, a very profound breakdown of the US constitutional and political order, which is, to my mind, quite simply the most important thing happening in the world right now by several orders of magnitude. And third, if it happens, we're living in a different world. We're living in a different world in America. It won't be like the first Trump administration. It'll be very, very different. And I think it will reshape the global political and the economic order in entirely unpredictable ways. We could have a long discussion of what some of those will be, but to me, this is now emerging as one of the great historical moments.
Okay, so we'll just have another conversation. We'll set that up closer to the US elections as this campaign shapes up and we have a clearer sense of who will be on the Republican ticket, whether that guy will be in jail or fighting from the streets, and that will indeed be a fascinating conversation. But for the time being, Martin Wolf from London, Gideon Rahman from Hong Kong for joining us on this roundtable. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Great pleasure.
If you like the video, do like, comment, share and subscribe.